Dámy a páni, dobrý večer. Ďakujem pekne.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for staying with us so long. Everything you should know about the technology you've heard already from the organizers and Mr. Orlovsky. Interpretation will also stay with us. Interpreting will be provided into Slovak, English, and Russian. The discussion will be held in English, and it will take 1 hour. And the topic of today is what is our motto, and that is, let's demand the impossible. The guests tonight are Mrs. Natalie Nougayréde, you've heard a while ago. Mr. Ivan Krastev, an important Bulgarian intellectual and writer. Professor Timothy Snyder, who you all know very well. I will say that after our discussion there will be a signing of the book with Mr. Krastev, Mr. Snyder, and Ms. Alexievich. They will stay with us during the signing of the books, which you can see and purchase at the absinthe booth.
It's like, oh, you want to listen in Russian, or okay? So the headline of our debate is asking for impossible. It's kind of a paraphrasis of the very old-fashioned way of talking by Che Guevara. That's the way it is, and it was largely used in the late 60s in France. Soyons réalistes, exigeons impossible. So let's be realistic, ask for impossible. What is impossible in the world today when everything seems very possible? Natalie.
First of all, on the slogan "Soyez réalistes, demandez l'impossible," it brings to mind obviously 1968. It's a slogan that was on the walls of Paris. And when we think about 1968, I can't help, as a European, I can't help thinking about how 1968 meant such different things in different parts of Europe also. And this is an anniversary year. We know 1968 did not have the same meaning in Prague, obviously, as in Paris. And we also know that the young people who were demonstrating in Paris in 1968 were rather indifferent, let's say it, rather indifferent to what would unfold in Prague in August of that year. So I try to be aware of these differences, because I think we need to, in Paris and London and other places, be aware of what 1968 was in this part of Europe, and and there were many discussions, I remember, between Bernard Kouchner, who was a French 1968er, and Adam Michnik. They even wrote a book about this discrepancy in Europe. But, to answer your question very briefly, because I feel like an intruder, there are two very powerful intellectuals on this stage, so I feel like an intruder. But I think that what is impossible today, and that maybe doesn't answer your question, but I think what is impossible today, and almost something that we need to avoid absolutely, is to simplify complex situations. So I think we're dying of oversimplification. And so I would say my wish would be that the impossible should be never simplify, never oversimplify complex situations. And maybe that's also the journalist speaking. We need to see complexity because we will only find solutions when we see the complexity of the problems.
Do you think that people are tired of complexities?
I think people are drowning in complexities, but what we need to try to do is seek some clarity, and clarity doesn't come with simplification. You know, you don't find solutions if you caricature a situation, or if you read it in a way that doesn't allow you to see the full picture. I think you know, we've all heard about post-truth and you know, alternative facts and all that. But that's one thing, to try to stick to the facts and to cherish facts and the effort of establishing facts. But also, you know, the multitude of facts makes for a complex situation. So I think politics is sometimes dying of oversimplification. What meaning do we put in certain words? I think we need to ask ourselves more questions.
Even Krastev, in your book, After Europe, which was published in Slovak language too, and you will have a pleasure to sign it for, or dedicate it for people who are interested. You try to make a picture of complexity of what's going on in Europe. So maybe for people who haven't read your book yet, but they will read it after this evening. What is the complex picture of what's going on in Europe when we are observing what's going on in Central Europe, in Italy, in Brexit's United Kingdom? What is the complexity picture of the situation we have here?
First, thank you very much for book being translated. If I'm going to retell it, there is no reason for you to buy it. At least I'm going to save you some money.
Yeah, but you don't have to. You don't have to tell the end of the book, you know. So.
But basically, first, I do believe that the question. I don't believe that we can understand what is going on the language of 1968. Mm-hmm. Because the problem is not that we cannot imagine the impossible. The problem is that many things that we believe are impossible are happening every day. And it's totally different. There are many things that you believe cannot happen, and they're happening, and this is becoming the problem. But when it talks to Europe, and particularly, basically, my major point of the book was, in a way, a very simple one. Because when people looking to Central and Eastern Europe, and it has something to do also with the 1968, particularly after the refugee crisis, the question was, what is happening with these people? Why they don't have refugees and they're so hostile to the refugees? Why they have been basically the first that have started to travel and they like so much on open borders? Why basically they stop liking it? And in my view, and this is very much about also, I do believe Svetlana Alexievich was great on this, it's important to listen to people. And this is my 3 points. First, migration is not about real stuff, what is happening or not happening. This is about the demographic imagination. Suddenly, people in Europe realize 2 simple things. We're living in a world which is very connected, but is very uneven. And now everybody knows how the others live, and if you're living in a very poor and badly governed place, if you want to change your life radically, better change the country than try to change the government. And to be honest, we East Europeans are the last one to blame people for doing this because we did it ourselves. But secondly, this creates the story, if this is the case, and if migration is the new revolution of the 21st century, what is going to happen with all these small nations, small cultures, speaking these strange languages like the Slovak and Bulgarians, and then people start panicking. They were panicking because of the demographic imagination, not because of the people coming, but because of the people that could come. And this is not fear, this is anxiety. This is anxiety because you have the feeling that you're living in a world which is threatening you, and you don't know how to react. And then you have these politicians that decided to make a vote out of it. But their fear is also different, because paradoxically, the biggest problem of Central and Eastern Europe is not the people coming, but the people leaving. 1/3 of the population of the Baltic republics has left in the last 25 years. 21% of the Bulgarians have left. Most of these people are younger people. So as a result of it, even if you're living better, and you're living in a society in which people want to go out for different reasons, you start feeling that you're on a losing side. Because why you want to stay basically in your place? Because your friends are around, because you know everything, and exactly this is happening. And I do believe that the paradoxical story between building the wall in the West and building the wall in the East is, in the West, politicians try to build a wall in order to stop foreigners coming. In places like Hungary, basically Mr. Orban tries to build a wall to stop people living. More people has left Hungary in the last 8 years than after 1956. And this is a tragedy. So from this point of view, we're talking about a real trauma, but this real trauma is the result of the fact that the world is moving, it is changing. By the way, the world never has been so ethno-homogeneous as after the World War II. And this is a story which for the Europeans was very difficult to understand exactly because when we say the word migration, we do believe that it means the same in Italy, in Bulgaria, in Germany, but in a certain way we're using the same words, we're talking about totally different fears and realities.
Is this the main issue of what's going on in Europe today, immigration, and as you told, the demographical imagination?
Listen, I believe that there was 4 different crises that in a certain way shattered some of the foundations of the European Union, which were all of them were very serious because they touched on something very important on which Europe was based. First, of course, was the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then first thing that was shattered was the idea that the next generation is going to live better than ours, and also that the poor countries are going to be, by kind of a natural law, to become richer. And this is, by the way, not true for Central and Eastern Europe, but it became a huge problem for a country like Greece. Even if the Greece economy is doing well, according to the IMF projections, in 50 years, the difference between the incomes of the Greeks and the Germans are going to be the same like between the Greeks and West Germans in the day when Greece entered the European Union. So from this point of view, you have this kind of a crisis of prosperity. And this is very real because prosperity was very important. Then comes the Ukrainian crisis, basically Russian annexation of Crimea, and something very important was challenged. We Europeans were convinced that when it comes to Europe, military power doesn't matter anymore. We were not so naive to believe that this doesn't matter anywhere, but we believe that in Europe it does not work. This was a continent without war. And then it appeared that it doesn't matter when you don't have it. But when you have it, military power matters. And for the Europe, it became a huge problem. Because the biggest success of Europe, pacification of European mind, appears to become Europe vulnerable. And you should deal with this. And the dealing of this is not simply putting money in the defense industries, because it's about also the mentality. And then comes Brexit. And the story with Brexit was that it changed the question. And nothing is more radical than changing the question. Before the Brexit, the question was, who next is going to join the European Union? And after Brexit, suddenly everybody started asking, who is next going to leave? And it was such a shock, it's so difficult to understand, that certainly certain idea of taking European Union for granted was not possible anymore. But out of all these crises, the migration crisis was the only one that was pan-European one. Paradoxically, in many countries, the financial crisis didn't touch. Poland was such a country. They even didn't get a recession. When it comes to the annexation of Crimea, for many countries, particularly on the south, it was not their issue. Brexit was a problem, but in a certain way, some people in Europe said, at last, the Brits are leaving, so we can go for further integration. And then came the migration crisis, which became a crisis, nevertheless, do you have migrants or not? Because it is also the problem of the borders of Europe. Where are the borders, and what kind of borders? And this was the question that Europeans were trying not to answer. In a certain way, we have been a union with a hard borders, with a hard budgets and soft borders. And suddenly this was not the case anymore, and you should answer the question, what is the meaning of a border?
Professor Snyder, in your recent books, you use, or maybe your editor is using this, the road to unfreedom, tyranny. It sounds very depressive and even darker than the situation is for real. Why you use these words in your book?
Well, let me try to answer that question by returning to the title of this panel, which I actually find very attractive, and I don't want to let the impossible go. I think it's very important for us to think about the things that we actually want, as opposed to the things that seem possible, because as Ivan Krastev has already said, our imaginations are much more limited than reality. Reality is full of all kinds of things, to paraphrase Shakespeare, which don't fit into our imaginations. And so if we want some of the good things to happen and not just bad things to happen, we first have to be able to imagine what those good things are going to be, even if they don't seem possible right now. So idealism isn't a sufficient condition for reform, but it's certainly a necessary condition for reform. And in that sense, all realism has to include a certain amount of idealism. And once we understand that very simple logical proposition, we have to start thinking about the things that are impossible, or at least the things that are impossible now, or the things that seem impossible to others. So I would actually answer your question by saying that I wrote On Tyranny and I wrote The Road to Unfreedom in the pursuit of a certain ideal. And the pursuit of that ideal, which like all ideals is impossible, is the truth. I think it's very important for us to pursue the truth. The truth is an excellent example of something which is impossible, but which is very much worth pursuing. So I wrote 20 lessons from the 20th century. I wrote On Tyranny because I thought it was simply true that we had much to learn from the 20th century that could help us in the 21st. I wrote The Road to Unfreedom because I was convinced by very conservative historical methodology that we could understand the rise of authoritarianism, not simply as a specter or as something vague, but that we could understand step by step how it was proceeding, according to what logics, according to what techniques, and that it is always better to understand the things that we fear than not to understand them. So I don't think that my picture of the world is particularly dark. I think rather it's better to see things as they are, or do your best to see things as they are, right? So I predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine. I wish I had been wrong, but I wasn't. And I like to think I was right because I was paying attention. I predicted that the Russian invasion of Ukraine would just be a larger part of an assault on truth in Europe and the United States. I wish I had been wrong about that, but I wasn't. I don't think that's, at the time people said, this is just your dark imagination, but no, it was the truth. It was simply the truth. The truth is often stranger than our imagination wants it to be. And so my point would be that if we want to make things better, our imagination has to exercise itself. Our imagination has to stretch itself. Our imagination has to work. We have to stop being surprised by the bad things and start surprising other people with the good things. And I actually think that factuality is a very good way for this to begin, because factuality is about the world around us, but it's also an ideal. It's an ideal pursued by reporters. No reporter can bring you the perfect truth any more than a doctor can bring you perfect health. But nevertheless, we should honor and respect, and above all, pay reporters, just as we honor and respect and pay doctors. And the reason for this, I think, is that factuality is the ideal which makes all the other ideals possible. So, for example, it's very important to me that we care about equality. But which, by the way, is another ideal, and it's impossible, right? But it's the kind of thing we should care about. But how are we going to pursue equality if we don't know what inequality looks like? Without the journalists, without the people who bring together the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, we have no idea what inequality looks like. So that's my idea of an impossibility that's worth pursuing. I would like to know about all the offshore banking accounts, not just some of them. I would like to know about all the anonymous real estate transactions, not just some of them. I'd like to know about all of them. I'd like to know about all of the American billionaires who are not paying their taxes. All of them. I'd like to know about all of them. That's an ideal. It will never be attained. But if we don't seek after factuality, then we can't pursue the other ideals, like, for example, equality. And what about freedom? What are the threats to freedom now? Well, they're numerous. But one of the threats to freedom is that we spend ever more time with our faces in front of screens, bleeding the most personal knowledge about ourselves into a wider world of computer programs that doesn't care about us as individual human beings, but only cares about us as material for as data material that can be assimilated, that can be brought together, and that can be used, usually in one way or another, against us. There are now titanic powers at work that if you were, on your computer right now, instead of listening to this lecture, I don't mean anyone in particular, but I might mean you, if you are online right now, are following you, tracking you, collecting data about you at a pace and with methods which we have a very hard time following or even believing in. This is a tremendous threat to human freedom, not just in places like China where it's already being perfected, but everywhere. We grow up now, our children grow up now, surrounded by these incredibly powerful algorithms which track them from the moment they go online for their entire lives. So how about this for an ideal? I want to know what the algorithms say. Why can't I know what the algorithms say? Why can't I know what Facebook's algorithms are? They're more important to my life and to your life than most of the Slovak laws. Why can't I know what they are? Why can't I know what Google's algorithms are? These things, you've heard of hacking, these things will never be hacked. The way that Facebook and Google process how you spend your time online, these things will never be hacked. These things are literally in vaults in undisclosed locations far, far away in provincial America. They will never be hacked. But these are the things that govern your lives. These are the things which figure out what you like and don't like. These are the things which learn and then control your tastes. These are the things which learn how to make you feel good. These are the things which frame choices before you even make choices, right? And we don't know what they are. So how about we learn about those things? How about we find out what the algorithms actually are? But my point is that that's a fact, right? These computer programs are lines of code. They exist in a specific form. We don't know what they are. And the way the world is now, we can't know what they are. But we should know what they are. This is the kind of thing that we should care about, right? So factuality, truth, is something we can never perfectly achieve. But if we pursue this impossible thing, truth, then we can also pursue other impossible things like equality and like freedom. So I like the idea of pursuing the impossible because honestly, I think all good things are essentially impossible.
So what? Ivan Krastev, do you want to react?
No, I very much agree. My question is, okay, we're going to know the algorithm, and they're going to tell us how they're selecting information. And by the way, there was a big story about Google, because if you know, years ago, you started to search a word. And very much the search is shaped by your previous searches. So if you take the computer of somebody else, and you're going to search on the same word, you're going to have different results. So basically, if you believe that the world is flat, and for the last 3 or 4 years you have been looking for the materials to tell you that the world is flat, when you start searching, some of the first results that you're going to get are going to tell you that the world is flat. So the biggest story is that you have a very strange type of manipulation, and even the manipulation here is not the game. Basically, The worst is that somebody said, I'm here to serve you. And this is the major difference with any type of a previous political regimes if you take algorithms as regimes. It's true for the Soviets. It was true for the fascists. They wanted to change the man. They didn't like the people in the way they are. This was true for the church. They wanted a different man, which is going to be defined differently in different ideology, but all of these were pedagogical regimes. For the first time, you have a political regime who said, I don't want to change you. I like you in the way you are. And I'm going to allow you to do everything that you do. I'm simply going to make money out of it. But it is also not unfair, because when you're talking about these algorithms, they're private algorithms. It's not the state, and I do believe this is a major change. And from this point of view, this is the change, because this is not the Orwellian world in which somebody is trying to ban you to do something. This is the world that is strengthening what you believe that you want to do. And the problem is you believe that you want to do it because somebody told you that this is what you want. And this is my last, this is the radical change. In a certain way, this is the end of the Enlightenment, because Enlightenment, good or bad, believed that I could be a very stupid man, which is probably true, but at least I know better what is best for me. And this is why I have one vote. And this is why somebody who is much smarter than me cannot vote for me. Now this is not anymore. And I do believe this change is so difficult for the people to resist, because normally you resist somebody who is banning you something. We were kind of learned to resist pressure on this. But when somebody is manipulating you by giving you what you want, this is the type of a manipulation we're not prepared for.
How are all these high-tech dangers linked to the rise of populism and far right in Europe and even in the United States?
Well, for one thing, by way of factuality precisely. So, I mean, what Ivan Krastev is describing is a regime which tells you what you think already. And that's terrifying, because what we think already is the worst thing about us. The best thing about us, going back to something that Svetlana Alexievich said, the best thing about us is our ability to listen to someone else and change our views. You know, John Maynard Keynes, who was one of the wisest people of the 20th century, said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? And what Ivan is describing is a world where no one ever has to change his mind. But I would go further than this. It's a world where no one ever has to truly have a mind, because the mind is the very thing which allows us to change. You can have opinions without having a mind. You can have strong convictions without having a mind. You can be very, very sure you're right without having a mind. Having a mind means that you're capable of taking things in and actively changing those convictions, those feelings. Being free means that you are able to listen to others and you're free to change yourself, which is a very high standard, actually. So I think Ivan is quite right to mention the Enlightenment. I would make a slightly different point, which is that Enlightenment was always hard work. The smartest people in the Enlightenment did not think that we were naturally rational creatures. They thought that Enlightenment was not a state of affairs. Enlightenment was a process, and it remains a process, just as de-enlightenment is a process. And I think in some respects what's happening is that we're being de-enlightened. The internet is a technology which presents itself as enlightening, but which for the most part is in fact de-enlightening. And I would push the point a bit further, I think dehumanizing, because it's not just that we become less able to think, it's that we become more able to think the way that machines think. And if you think down that alley, that's where things become truly frightening, because the internet is not a neutral environment. It's an environment inhabited by programs which are teaching you how to think the way that they think. And because we're humans, we tend to adapt. But anyway, the way that it connects to populism is this. The natural defense of the individual against authoritarianism is factuality. If you don't believe in the factual world, then you will be overwhelmed by any kind of authoritarianism. If it's the old-fashioned authoritarianism, if it's fascism, it offers you a powerful myth, which makes sense of all the facts. If it's Stalinism, it explains to you that some facts can be ignored and some facts are part of a grand story. If it's the new kind of authoritarianism, what it says is, there aren't really facts, nothing's really true, but the way you feel is extremely important, and we like the way that you feel, especially if the way that you feel is angry and anxious and depressed. Then we really like the way you feel. We'd like you to be more angry and anxious and depressed. So against any form of authoritarianism, the natural defense shield of the individual is factuality, because if you believe in facts, then you believe in one more thing besides how you feel. Of course we believe in how we feel, right? Of course we care about how we feel. If you're hungry out there, you're hungry out there, and none of my fine words is going to change the fact that you're hungry. But in addition to how we feel, there's also the factual world. And the factual world is the one thing which keeps us from being manipulated. And that's the connection. And that's why pretty much all of the populists now are pro-feeling and anti-fact.
Natalie.
Can I wanted to maybe go back to your question, which I think I didn't answer very well, but my desired impossible right now is that, and it brings together some of the brilliant things that have been said, my desired impossible right now is that we all as European citizens find a way to bring out our energy to reinvigorate the European project, which we all belong to. I think that's absolutely essential, that we cherish it and want to strengthen it and fix it where it's not working well, but care about it and really care about it very strongly. And I think that next year the European Parliament election will be a key moment where I think an unprecedented election for European institutions, at least as we've known them. And why does this matter? Because I think, for a long time, the narrative about the European project, I'm French, I live in London, and I've lived in other countries in Europe. For a long time, the narrative about the European project, for somebody like me who grew up in Western Europe, it was, we're preserving peace. That was the narrative. And still today, we hear this. It's preserving peace. We know that's not enough anymore, because we know younger generations don't necessarily connect to that in the same way as previous generations or my generation. It's necessary, of course, and we know that peace is not guaranteed. Look at Ukraine. But we know that message is not enough. And so we have to find a kind of a new narrative. And I think the narrative about being part of the European club brings you instant prosperity and makes your living standard instantly, like the Germans, for example. We know that narrative is insufficient or not always very credible. So we have to find a new narrative, and I think it should be that the European project is a project that protects us as citizens in our rights as citizens of liberal democracies. And we know what we have learned from Trump, from authoritarian sliding in different countries, is that democracy and liberal institutions that uphold it are not guaranteed. If there's one thing, and you know this in this country, if there's one thing we know, it's more fragile than we thought. It is that the institutions of liberal democracies need to be protected. And why does that matter to each of us individually? Because at the end of the day, it's our right as a citizen, my right to find reliable information, my right to vote with entirely a free choice, my right to kick out the government if I want to, if I'm unsatisfied with it. And I think these are essential things, and also they go to the question of the digital world. We feel that it's completely out of control. If there's one entity today in the world that has perhaps a chance of creating of pushing towards norms where perhaps we would see inside those algorithms, you know, one day, I think I agree with Tim, we need to know what those algorithms are made of. Today, there's no possibility to find out. Well, the European Union, because of its economic weight, is, I think, a rare entity that has the possibility, it's not there yet, but that has the possibility to say to some of the big players from Silicon Valley, if you want to do business in our territory, our block of 500 million, you know, then you have to show your cards, and you have to give some information. That's not censorship, that's transparency in the way that citizens are more informed about what influences them on a daily basis. The first thing we do is, when we wake up, is look at our smartphone. How do we know what the mechanisms are that push content to us? So anyway, I wanted to pitch that. I think you know, it sounds institutional to say we need to defend the European Union, but I think it's our horizon right now in Europe is to reinvigorate the European project and how we care about it.
Ivan, please.
Listen, but in my view, it's also very important because 10 years ago, we're going to stay here. We're going to talk about technology, and it's going to be a very positive utopian talk. People are going to tell you that because of the social media, you have people on the streets that have not been organized by political party. It is still true. So from this point of view, the biggest problem today is that the best and the worst is the same thing. And for me, this is why it is, because it's easy. I don't use mobile. Social media didn't hurt me at all. I don't know what it is about. But so from this point of view, it's easy to go simply anti-technological, but we're talking about something totally different. All these things that we don't like, by the way, also rooted in the same 1968, which we so much like to talk about. People don't like Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is the embodiment of the idea of authenticity. He's one of the most authentic person you can imagine. He's one of the most non-hypocritical men that you can imagine. He never said anything. He all the time said, it's about me. It's me. This is because I want it like this. So from this point of view, this is what is becoming difficult, and this is why we cannot simply say there is a problem with the right-wing populism because we all are part of something that is transformatively changing. It's not that part of the society is changing and we others are not changing. And here comes the idea of experience, because I very much want to touch on something that Tim was talking about. 3 or 4 years ago, I was very much really kind of shattered by a report coming in the New York Times talking about the experience of one of the American military units in Afghanistan. As you know, now fighting a war is highly technological. So you have all these soldiers who basically never see the enemy. They're basically getting the signal from the center, from Dayton, telling them shoot left or shoot right. This is like in a games war. So basically they ask the permission from their leadership to go on the ambush with knives. They wanted basically physically to see the enemy. They wanted the permission to kill by knives. Because in a certain way, this is the dehumanization, because it sounds awful, you're killing by knife, but you know that on the other side there is a human being. Normally when you're shooting left or right, for you they're giving a position. You don't see a person, you never experience this person. And I do believe that when we talk about factuality and feelings and so on, one of the things that's so difficult is that the experience that we have as individuals does not help us so much to understand the world around us, exactly because the world became very big, very complex. My everyday life is not helping me to understand many of the things that are happening in the world. And either I'm going to trust somebody, be it media, be it government, be it somebody else, or I'm going to trust nobody. And I do believe, and this is my Bulgarian experience, which in my view is important because seeing also what is happening in Slovakia. 2013, some unpleasant character was appointed by the government to become the head of the Bulgarian counterintelligence. You needed a lot of imagination to come with this appointment. So from this point of view, 100,000 people by social media ended up on the street. Okay, he resigned in the next day, people stayed on the street, they wanted change. But on the same time, they didn't trust anybody. They didn't trust politics, they didn't want basically to vote, and you end up with the following situation. On the public opinion polls, 70% of the people ask that they want new elections. And 63% of them said that they are not going to vote on these elections because there is nobody to vote. So I do believe one of the biggest problems for the modern culture is how to use sense of mistrust, which is very important. Democracy without mistrust cannot exist. But on the other side, mistrust can be extremely disempowering thing. If you don't trust anybody, you have lost. And in my view, this is the biggest challenge to all these societies in which how basically we can learn to trust somebody, be person next to you, be anybody.
It's up to you to answer this question here. How to restore the trust in the society?
Well, it goes back, I think, to something we've already talked about. There have to be institutions. So this government by mistrust starts somewhere, and it starts very specifically with the death of local news. This behemoth, right? This Russian rule of the way that the Russian regime works, with which we're all familiar to some extent. We're familiar with Russian television. We're familiar with Surkov. We're familiar with the idea that when nothing is true, everything is possible. But that starts somewhere, and that starts with the end of local and regional news in Russia. And this turns out to be a fairly universal pattern, according to people who study this. Once you lose local news, people lose the ability to trust. Because the special thing about local news is that you know the reporter. The reporter, that man, that woman, is somebody that you actually see. And so the reporter is also a human being. And this closes the gap between the media and other human beings. It's the necessary link between human beings and the media. In the United States, after 2008, we lost our local reporters. In the year 2009, on an average, 40 American reporters lost their jobs every day in the calendar year 2009. So by the time we get to 2014, 2016, we don't have the kind of trust in that institution that we used to have. Americans, instead of talking about journalists and reporters and specific people, are talking about the media. And as soon as people are talking about the media, the game is already over. The media, by definition, are not trusted. But reporters you might trust. So I think there is actually a very simple institutional answer to this problem, which is that we can't just play defense all the time. We can't just call out the liars when they lie, important though that is. When we have a chance, we have to find ways to fill the public space with facts. We have to invest resources, public and private, in journalism, especially local journalism, to fill the public space with facts. Because the paradoxical thing about our situation is that everybody talks about the news, but almost nobody writes the news down. Almost nobody. In the United States of America, which is a country of more than 300 million people, we have 40,000 registered journalists, and of those 40,000, only a handful are actually doing the job of going out and covering news as investigative reporters. And by the way, they're outnumbered about 10 to 1 by people who work in public relations. In other words, people whose job it is to ruin their work, right? So there is a fairly straightforward answer to this trust question, and that is we have to think of factuality as a resource. We have to think of it as a product, as something that we actually make. It's not just out there on its own. If we leave the debates to go the way the debates go, according to the way that people with money want them to go, or according to the way that the algorithms find most emotionally sustainable, we're never going to find the truth. If you bring 4 people together who hold 4 different, completely wrong and crazy views, we can talk all night, but you will never get to the truth. In order to get to the truth, you actually have to have the facts in the public sphere.
How can the living person fight the algorithm you were talking about?
Well, this is the thing. Okay, so I mean, I'm not anti-tech. I'm pro-human. I like humans, and the machines don't care what I think, right? You can't hurt their feelings because they're machines. And this is the strange way about how we behave online. We act like our computers care what we do. They don't care. Whether you hit like or not, the machine doesn't care. It doesn't care if you lovingly stroke your keyboard. It's a machine, right? And we're people, and I care about the people. And what's the odd thing which has happened is that we have let the way that we think about people slowly be reshaped by what's comfortable for the machines and for the people who write the programs for the machines. And so slowly, slowly in the real world, the way we behave towards real people has been shaped by like, don't like, binary choices. Does this immediately make me feel good or not? Which are all impulses which we have learned from the machines. We have tried to make the machines feel good, and as a result, we make our fellow citizens and our fellow people feel bad. Anyway, I'll answer your question, which is that it's very easy to mess around with the world of the machines. One thing that every single person can do, and which I'm sure many of you do, is that before you go on Facebook, or if you're less than 50 years old and don't use Facebook, before you go on Instagram, or I'm not going to show off by like naming a whole bunch of cool social platforms, but before you go on your favorite social platform, don't go on your favorite social platform, go onto a newspaper site, find an article by an investigative reporter, read it, and post it. And do that every morning before you do any other goddamn thing on the internet. Every morning, find an article written by a real person and post it on social media. Do it every day, because that pays reporters' salaries, and it changes the internet, you see? And imagine if that's the only thing you did on the internet. Then the internet would think that journalism was really valuable.
Yeah. But here comes the story. Why we went to the machines? Because it's why people basically believe that better the machine to decide. Because we believe in fairness. And fairness means that you should treat everybody equally. And we don't believe that people can treat people equally. Only machine is treating people equally. So in my view, this is quite interesting because all these things that we're talking now coming as a problem were the result of kind of a certain values that we really cared about. And in my view, this is quite important because it's going to change very much. Next year, one of the big banks, not Erste, starts deciding every loan which is under 10,000 euro to be decided by the FACE trustworthiness program. So you go, you ask for the money, and basically the program tells you you're getting the money or not getting the money. And this is critically important. People who have been talking about this, they said it saves money, and also, to be honest, they said this is fair because corruption is not there. This is coming from a country which is quite corrupt. So they said, we are going to cut corruption. Here's the story. Imagine that you go to a bank, and the person rejects you for your loan. Then you go back home and you can tell your wife, I saw this idiot, and he did this and this, but you believe that there is another person to whom you can go. And even when he's telling you no, he's explaining you why he's not giving you this damn 10,000. When you go to the machine, for the first time that you're rejected by the system is not a metaphor anymore. The system is the system. And then, by the way, this is going to happen also in the social sciences. For people who are doing big data, they know very well that big data are much better with precision. I can much better predict this or that, but I don't have an explanation anymore. I can tell you what is most likely to happen, but I cannot tell you why. And here is the biggest problem with the machines. Machines do not produce stories. Machines give you judgments, predictions, some of them like basically being in the medicine, none of us is against the fact that certain machines are there. But when it comes to the human relations, you're more and more coming to the world without why. You're going to have the social science in which the question why cannot be answered. You know, for example, that if this and this and this person has this and this characteristics, most probably he's going to vote this way. This is a very strong pattern which you're getting from the big data, but you don't know why. And I do believe this humanization story is very important because everything that you're doing and everything that gives us meaning is based on answering the why question. And I do believe society without why, this is also what scares me. And it's not, then even if you know the algorithm, it's not going to be enough, because just knowing the algorithm is not going to help you to be governed by somebody who gives explanations. And this is my last point about democracy. Listen, democracy is not a great regime, and people are lying all the time, but this is going to be even worse when politicians even don't care to lie to you. Imagine that basically decisions are taken in which they said, listen, this was how we have been advised by our computer advisor, we're going to go this way. And from this point of view, this world without why is something that, in my view, should scare us most, because this is destroying the very way in which we are functioning as a society.
Yeah. So I think one of what you asked earlier about the relationship between technology and populism, and I would venture the following speculation. It has a lot to do with the end of the future. So in 1968, however misguided people might have been, be it in Prague or in Paris, they all believed in the future. They all had some ideas of the future. In 1970s, 1980s, people in the West still had an idea of the future. In the 1990s and the 2000s, we had an idea of the future. Admittedly, it was a very boring and stale idea, but we still thought the future was coming. I think the most interesting thing about political imagination now is that we don't have a future. Everything takes place either today or in a misremembered and mischaracterized past. And I think that has a lot to do with everything that we're talking about. The way that populists govern is usually not by promising a different future. Those were the old populists in the 19th century. Today, populists don't really have an idea about the future. They tend to drive you back into the past by way of ideas of memory, which is one of my least favorite words. Or in Poland, there's this idea of historical policy. So you're being driven back again into the past. And, you know, by the way, American political scientists, who ask about everything, ask people, when was America great? The reason why they ask, of course, is that our president is one of these populists who constantly drives you back into a past which never existed. And the answer to the question, when was America great, turns out to be when I was young, right? And, you know, that's just not something which the state can actually give to you, despite what some of our billionaires think. But the future, I think, is the crucial issue, because despite appearances, the technology is taking the future away. Think of the example that Ivan gave. You want to get a loan. The computer program judges you entirely on the basis of your past. It will run protocols about everything you've done in the past. It doesn't care what you might do, what you might think. It doesn't care if you have an interesting idea. It's extremely conservative. And these examples are not just hypothetical. In the American labor market right now, there are about 80 million people who are basically stuck at a certain level of employment. And one of the reasons why, and this is a big thing, one of the reasons why the American dream is dead, one of the reasons why Americans have a hard time thinking about the future is they can't get the jobs they want. And one of the reasons they can't get the jobs they want is that almost all of the first round of employment applications in my country are handled by computers. And what the computers do is look for certain kinds of catches, like where you went to school and did you graduate. In other words, it's all about the past. You might actually be a really good candidate for a particular job. You might have prepared yourself individually for it. But if the publicly available data about your past doesn't sound right to the program, you never get a chance to make your case about why you would be a good candidate for that job. And for most people, that's a really important thing. And for most Americans, and I think for a lot of Europeans too, your ability to change jobs and get a job that you think actually makes sense for you is really important. So the point I'm trying to make, the larger point, is that this technology, which is bright and shiny and has propaganda about it, is actually in some ways unbelievably conservative and reactionary and tends to take the future away.
So you have explained how to beat internet, and now you can, all of you, tell us, probably you have some ideas about how to beat the populists and extremists. It's maybe not only with the posting the good papers and good stories on the internet.
I mean, I'm a historian, so I've got really, no one's ever going to pay me for my ideas about how to, beat the populists. But I have one idea, and here's the idea. You can't beat the populists in the past. You can't beat them by going halfway. You can't say, like, you have a glowing picture of the Slovak past that never happened, and I've got a glowing picture of the Slovak past that never happened that's half as good as yours. Which is this, you're going to lose that way. You can't beat the populists by talking about the past. You can't beat the populists unless you can recreate the future. This is my basic view. And whoever recreates the future first is going to be the big winner of politics in the 21st century. And going back to what Natalie said about Europe, this has everything to do with Europe. Because what Europe has done is that it's allowed the politics of symbols to be retained at the national level. Europe basically has no politics of symbol, but the things that Europe does are actually directed towards a future in a way that national states often aren't. She already gave some very important examples. One of them is cyber, and the other of them is climate, right? Cyber and climate are arguably the two things which are most going to shape whether those of you who are under 50 are going to have sane lives in the 21st century. Europe is the only entity which is concertedly doing anything about both of them. But my point is that if Europe's going to exist, it's going to exist in the future. Like, this is my view. Like, if Europe, the one thing Europe can do to make itself exist is to create a symbolic politics of the future. And I think the one way to beat populists at the national level is to say, look, we have a way of making the country much better in 1 year, 2 years, and 5 years, and this is how we're going to do it.
But here on populism, one of the ways not to beat populism is calling populist everybody whom you don't like. Because in a certain way, this type of an emptiness, and this is, first of all, they're very different. We're calling different political figures and parties populists, and this is the moment when we start to be interested in their differences. Between Mr. Orban and Mr. Kaczynski, there are major differences. Mr. Kaczynski is a very reactionary person who is not corrupt, to the extent that he's totally not interested in money. Mr. Orban cannot be accused of this. I'm saying this because in a certain way, I'm afraid that there are certain phrases that kill our curiosity. They're very different political regimes with different logic, based in different histories. And in a certain way, if you want to beat somebody, first be sure who he is. Because what I'm afraid is that, and this is part of this wrong type of symbolic politics, it's not about the future, but it's about trying to create the other person. And here is one data from the American political science that I always found very kind of disturbing, because this is basically very much about people like us. It appeared that people that have a university education are becoming much more tolerant to think when it comes to religion, ethnicity, race, but we're becoming much more non-tolerant towards people who do not share our political views. And I do believe this is critically important, because if you basically believe that the other person is simply a populist, in a certain way, you have already lost, because you're in his game. And his game is, it's a tribal identity, everybody stays with his own, and this is where we are.
Natalie, please.
I think that's a very important point. I mean, I, like everybody, use the word populist, and I also write it, but I'm starting increasingly to think that actually I would much prefer, because it goes to the heart of the matter and the heart of what should be worrying us, and what we need to protect. The word I prefer is anti-democratic. You know, basically a populist who is a threat to the institutions of liberal democracy. That's my enemy. That's where I draw my line, my red line. A populist who is just a social conservative, but does not try to attack the institutions of liberal democracy, that's a different category. That's a different category. But to perhaps a small caveat on what you said, Ivan, because in my mind, yes, there are differences between the personalities and the ways of Kaczynski and Orban, but both of them are they both embody now regimes which include a certain dismantling of the institutions of liberal democracy. You know, there is a threat to democratic values and principles
totally agree.
In Poland, just as in
but they're different.
Hungary.
My idea is the following: it's not that one is good or the other is bad, but if you want politically to fight somebody, you should try to define him locally and contextually.
Okay. So, I mean, like, as a historian, I couldn't agree more about, like, the local context. But as a political strategist, I'm going to say something slightly different, which is that it's very important to know yourself, too. So there are limits beyond which we don't actually understand Trump, Putin, Kaczynski, Orban. We should try to understand them. But I think a lot of defeating the people you're calling the populists, which, by the way, I don't use the word myself at all, ever, but a lot of defeating them has to do with defining what it is we actually want. So you can win maybe one election on the defensive. The Democrats just now in the United States, I think, just consumed that. They won their one election by being against Trump. But if they're going to win in 2020, it's not going to be being against Trump. It's going to be by being for something that they can define. And so this is why I think the question of the panel is actually very well posed. What are the things that we're actually going to demand of ourselves? Because even if Orban and Kaczynski are different, which of course they are in exactly the way Ivan says, it could nevertheless be the case that the way to beat them is the same, or at least that some of the things that we need to support are the same. And I do think there are some lowest common or highest common denominators here, and one of them is precisely journalism. Whether it's Saudi Arabia or Russia or Hungary or Poland or Slovakia or the United States of America, support of local journalism everywhere makes sense. Not as an immediate way to beat an immediate populist, but as a way to have the hope that there will be democratic politics over the long run.
Yeah, and here I also to agree and to make additional. The idea of defense is very important, because when somebody go against the institutions, and you're absolutely right, particularly when it comes to the judicial power and others, our natural reflex is to defend. You're defending, but at the same time, you should keep in mind that people were voting for some of these people not because they're totally captured by their integrity or their ideas, but because they do believe politics is about change. And they are very frustrated, and we know this very well, at least from where I'm coming. In Bulgaria, being re-elected till recently was more difficult than being resurrected. I mean, we have been governed from everywhere, from the left, from the right, then come the king from above. Then come basically the bodyguard from the king, from below. So every options have been there. And people have the feeling, and this is a major difference between, for example, Russia and this type of democracies, you have two different forms of there is no alternative. In Eastern Europe, the idea was during the accession, you can change government as much as you want, but you're not much changing policies. In Russia, you can change policies, you cannot change people in power. And from this point of view, this is different. And from this point of view, if people do not believe that their vote can produce change, then there is no future. Because future is also about change. And from this point of view, I'm very much afraid if anti-populism is simply defending. Because if you're defending, you're basically telling the people, go back where we were. We're never going to be back where we were. And by the way, people had good reasons to know why they didn't like something about the 1990s or about 2000s. And from this point of view, it's extremely important also to recognize that one of the legitimacy of democracy is to give people the right to make mistakes. If people cannot make mistakes, then political experience doesn't matter. And this was always, democracy never was such a great regime that people were talking about. I love this story about the famous American actor Cary Grant, who once went on some type of a charity party, and there was a lady who was checking the tickets, and he has forgotten the ticket. And she said, if you don't have a ticket, you cannot enter. And he said, I'm Cary Grant. And she looked at him and said, you do not look like Cary Grant. And he said, nobody looks like Cary Grant. So from this point of view, democracy is never what basically it is always in the textbooks, but it has the capacity for self-correction. And in my view, the most important is this capacity for self-correction, because the moment you're losing this, then we're talking about profound crisis.
But I mean, starting from there, what's wrong with saying democracy is a good thing? I mean, I've heard Winston Churchill cited that democracy is the worst system, except for all the other ones, 1,000,000 times. And I don't want to ever hear it cited again. What about just saying democracy is good? What about saying democracy is one of these impossible things that we want? Of course, the people will never rule, but the idea that the people should rule, right, is an interesting idea. And even if it can never completely, as the ancient Greeks warned us, even if it can never completely push aside the oligarchs and the manipulation, oligarchs being their word, even if it can't do that, surely it's an interesting idea or an ideal worth pursuing. I mean, this idea, Natalie's point about anti-democratic, is true in a very basic sense. In the United States of America, a very large percent of the population cannot legally vote. We have a lot to work on. In the last 5 years, 22 of the 50 American states have passed laws making it harder for African Americans and other minorities to vote. 22 American states. So democracy itself is one of these good things. And I would recast Yvonne's point in a much more idealistic way. I think it's a remarkable thing that people are allowed to change their minds in politics. I mean, traditionally in politics, if you get it wrong, they kill you. I mean, for most of human society, if you're in the wrong clan, if you are in the wrong side of a battle, you're dead, right? Or in the very best scenario, you're living in under some kind of tyranny, which we could barely imagine. I think it's a wonderful thing that we get to change our minds. And I think it's therefore so I would actually think part of this notion of the future is that we have to realize that democracy is not this machine which is just kind of out there, but it's something that we have to build. It's something that we have to create. And the reason we should create it is because it's good. I mean, the business of creating the future is not trivial. There's a reason why most of the people who we might not like in this room don't talk about the future. There's a reason for that. And the converse of it is that democracy actually creates the future. The beginning of modern politics in the 18th century, the idea that the people should be inside politics coincides, and this is no coincidence, coincides with the beginning of historical time. It's at the same moment that mass politics begins. It's at the same moment when people start thinking about modern democracy that we start to think about time as being something that flows from past through present into the future. Democracy creates time because democracy says, I made a mistake, I'm going to correct that mistake so there will be a better future. We take this for granted, but it's actually an extraordinary thing.
Okay, we have the... This is the very last question for this evening because we have to finish before you start again. Your autograph session over there. So let's go back to the headline of this evening. What should it be the first impossible thing we should ask for and fight for? Natalie, perhaps.
You know, I'm going to sound a little bit more well-read than I actually am, but I read a book by an American professor called Samuel Moyn, and the title is The Last Utopia, and it's about the movement, international movement for human rights. You know. Now, I'm born in 1966, and so my political awakening is in the mid-'80s, '90s certainly. And I used to take the movement for human rights, the international movement for human rights, as something for granted. I thought it almost always existed, you know, since the Second World War. You know, I thought 1945, for sure, there's a massive movement for human rights. Amnesty International, all these conventions. And what you read in this book is that, in fact, it's a very recent thing. It bloomed in the 70s for many reasons. I won't go into them. And it became an utopia, the last utopia, as this professor Samuel Moyn writes. And I think that we have to invent our new utopia, which is a combination of human rights and respect for dignity and confidence in the future. I think the best way to fight the anti-democrats is to reassure people about the future. You know, don't give way to fear. Just be more confident, and you know, and just like there's healthy food and there's bad food. There's healthy information and there's bad information. So you know, don't go to the junk food or junk information places, as was pointed out earlier. And I think to build that, just, you know, that confidence that you can treat yourself well by giving yourself reliable information, just like you want to eat healthy food. You can also build confidence in the fact that you can, you know, play a role and defend things in society that matter. And so I think we have to rebuild our last utopia, and I think that's very much democracy and individuals feeling respected in democracy and confident about the future.
Thank you. Ivan, same question.
Yeah. Listen, for me, what's interesting is it's not exactly true that we don't have idea of future. We don't have idea of a collective future. If you see on the level of the individual, we very much have, and people are thinking about the future. And one of the things that happened is part of the sum of really the bad things that are happening to us is also affecting it. We're living quite long. And we're living so long that we start to think about ourselves also through the lives of our kids. I was very much interested, and I read what people in the Silicon Valley are reading and trying to compare basically with what politicians in Washington are reading. And this is very interesting because these are two groups that are going very much to shape this discussion. Politicians are reading history, and mainly biographies. Political biography. This is the major reading of any politician. This is not unknown. What they're reading in the Silicon Valley basically is an old science fiction from the 20th century, because the new science fictions, most of them is dystopian. I'm saying this because in order to have a collective idea of the future, you should start with the problem, who are we who are fantasizing? In the 19th century, it was an ethnic group which was basically dreaming about the national state. It was about a class that was dreaming about a classless society. So now it became so difficult because the only two things that remained was the individual and the humanity as a whole. And this is not easy to dream for the humanity as a whole. And from this point of view, this is the interesting story with democracy. Democracy is giving you a community, which is the community of faith, which is not just the world, but it is not just you. And in my view, this is part of the story with this strange kind of obsession of ours. We think about the future all the time, but we don't dream about it because the dreams, political dreams, can be only collective ones.
Thank you. And finally, Timothy Snyder.
This is very much along the lines of what I was thinking about when you asked the first question, because Ivan Krastev is of course completely right. There are ideas of the future, and they take up a lot of space in the discussion. In the United States, which, you know, the purpose of the United States is to serve as a warning for Europe, just as the purpose of Russia is to serve as a warning for the United States. In the United States, the space, the rhetorical space of the future is taken up essentially by the crazy fantasies of Silicon Valley billionaires. So we do have ideas about the future. Idea number one, I'm going to live forever. Not you, but just me. And maybe my best friend here, but certainly not all of you. Idea number two, I'm going to go to Mars and mess everything up on Mars just like I messed everything up here. Probably not you, right? But I'm going to go to Mars. The characteristic thing about these views of the future, and I'm not exaggerating, it's actually worse than I say, is that they're unbelievably narcissistic. I mean, in addition to being impossible, because I'm going to tell you guys a big secret and make a prediction, the Silicon Valley billionaires are not going to live forever. They're going to die.
At least not all of them.
Yeah. I mean, and I mean, look, the same guys who talk about living forever drive sports cars and don't wear their seatbelts. I mean, I just drop that as a little hint of how it's all going to go. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking, yeah, we have ideas of the future. The problem is that these ideas of the future are radically privatized. And these radically privatized ideas of the future are taking up all the space. And so when you asked us to think about the impossible, I was trying to think about the impossible where we can go together. And that's why I was thinking of things like factuality, and in the end, things like democracy, because I think democracy itself, like truth, it's an impossibility, but it's an impossibility that we can all aim for together. And so I think there are different kinds of impossibles. There are the impossibles which are actually present in the culture, but are basically oligarchic. And then there are the impossibles which we need to all think about together, because it's true, if we're going to have a vision for the future, whether it's for Europe or America or anyone else, it's going to have to be a vision which captures a lot of us and where we feel like we're actually doing something to make it come about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming and for joining us for the celebration of the 17th of November. It was the day when many things became very possible in these countries, and there is still many things to do, but it's at the very same place we are facing it still 29 years ago. So thank you very much for joining us, and you will have probably a short break before you are kindly asked to move to the little bookstore over there. Natalie?
I'll just have a glass of wine.
Ďakujeme pekne, že ste s nami strávili večer.
Thank you very much for having spent this evening with us. Natalie Nougayréde was with us today, tonight, Ivan Krastev and Timothy Snyder. I would like to wish you again a very good 17th of November. It is a symbolic day.